In a significant legal development, the United States District Court for the District of Columbia is currently addressing the case against former President Donald J. Trump, documented as Case 123-CR0257-TSC. The government has filed a motion regarding immunity determinations, asserting that Trump's actions in attempting to overturn the 2020 presidential election do not qualify for presidential immunity. The government argues that Trump's claims of immunity are unfounded, while he was the incumbent president during the alleged conspiracies. The government contends that his actions were fundamentally private in nature. The filing states, "The defendant acted as a candidate when he pursued multiple criminal means to disrupt, through fraud and deceit, the government function by which votes are collected and counted, a function in which the defendant, as president, had no official role." The Supreme Court's ruling in Trump v. United States established that while presidents may be immune from prosecution for certain official conduct, the government believes that the conduct in question here does not fall under that protection. The motion emphasizes that the Supreme Court remanded the case to determine whether the remaining allegations against Trump are immunized, concluding that they are not. The government's motion is structured into four main sections. The first section provides a detailed statement of the case that the government intends to prove at trial, including the conduct alleged in the superseding indictment and other evidence that will be presented. This aligns with the Supreme Court's ruling that presidential immunity includes an evidentiary component that should be addressed at the outset of a proceeding. In the second section, the motion outlines the legal principles governing claims of presidential immunity. It states that the court must first determine whether the conduct was official or unofficial by analyzing the relevant content, form, and context. The filing cites the case Blassingame v. Trump, which clarifies that if the defendant was acting as office seeker, not office holder, then no immunity applies. The third section applies these legal principles to Trump's conduct, asserting that nothing the government intends to present to the jury is protected by presidential immunity. While some discussions Trump had with the vice president about their official responsibilities may qualify as official, the government argues that the presumption of immunity is rebutted. The filing states, all of the defendant's remaining conduct was unofficial, indicating that Trump was acting as a candidate for re-election rather than in his official capacity as president. Finally, the fourth section explains the relief sought by the government, requesting that the court determine that Trump's conduct is not immunized and that he must stand trial on the superseding indictment. The factual proffer presented by the government outlines how Trump, after losing the 2020 presidential election, resorted to criminal actions to try to remain in power. The filing details a series of plans to overturn legitimate election results in several states, including Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. These efforts included lying to state officials, manufacturing fraudulent electoral votes, and attempting to obstruct Congress's certification of the election results. The government describes Trump's scheme as a private criminal effort, stating that he used deceit to target every stage of the electoral process. The filing details how Trump and his co-conspirators engaged in three conspiracies: to interfere with the federal government function of collecting and counting election results, to obstruct the official proceeding of Congress certifying the election, and to conspire against the rights of millions of Americans to vote and have their votes counted. The motion outlines how Trump laid the groundwork for these conspiracies well before the election, with advisors warning him that the election would be close and that he might not win on election night. The government highlights Trump's public statements leading up to the election, where he repeatedly suggested that he could only lose due to fraud, and his eventual declaration of victory on election night, despite the ongoing vote count. In the immediate aftermath of the election, the government alleges that Trump's operatives sought to create chaos at polling places, rather than seeking clarity, as they attempted to disrupt the vote counting process. This motion represents a critical moment in the ongoing legal proceedings against Donald Trump, as the court will need to determine the applicability of presidential immunity to the actions he is accused of taking in the wake of the 2020 election. The outcome of this case could have significant implications for the accountability of public officials and the integrity of the electoral process in the United States. The defendant's outreach to state officials was characterized by a clear intent to manipulate the electoral process. In Georgia, for instance, the defendant made a phone call to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, pressuring him to find enough votes to overturn the election results. This call exemplified the defendant's strategy of targeting officials who were in positions to influence the electoral outcome, all while disregarding the established legal processes and the factual integrity of the election results. The defendant's insistence on fraudulent claims during this call, despite the absence of any evidence to support them, further illustrated his awareness of the falsity of his assertions. In Arizona, the defendant's campaign sought to challenge the legitimacy of the election results by contacting state lawmakers and urging them to convene a special session to address unfounded allegations of fraud. The defendant's approach was not only to spread misinformation, but also to incite action that could disrupt the lawful certification of electors. His communications with state officials were often accompanied by threats of political retribution, signaling that failure to comply with his demands could have consequences for their political futures. In Michigan, the defendant's campaign organized a meeting with state legislatures, where he and his allies attempted to persuade them to disregard the election results and appoint electors who would support him. This effort was marked by a blatant disregard for the democratic process, as the defendant sought to leverage his influence to alter the outcome of the election through coercion rather than legitimate legal channels. The defendant's actions in Nevada mirrored those in other states, as he and his co-conspirators spread false narratives about voter fraud and sought to undermine the state's electoral process. They engaged in a campaign of disinformation that included press releases, social media posts, and public statements that were designed to create confusion and doubt about the election's integrity. This strategy was not only aimed at the public, but also at state officials who were tasked with certifying the election results. In Pennsylvania, the defendant's campaign filed numerous lawsuits challenging the election results, many of which were dismissed for lack of evidence. Despite these legal setbacks, the defendant continued to publicly assert that the election had been stolen, further perpetuating the false narrative that he had actually won. His refusal to accept the court's rulings demonstrated a clear intent to undermine the judicial process and the rule of law. The defendant's efforts to alter the ascertainment and appointment of electors were not isolated incidents, but rather part of a broader strategy to delegitimize the election results across multiple states. His campaign's coordinated actions included rallying supporters, disseminating false information, and pressuring state officials, all aimed at creating a narrative that would support his claims of victory. As the situation escalated, the defendant's rhetoric became increasingly incendiary, culminating in the rally on January 6, 2021. At this event, he incited his supporters to march to the Capitol, framing their actions as a necessary response to the alleged fraud. This rally served as a catalyst for the violent events that followed, as the defendant's words fueled the anger and frustration of his supporters, leading them to storm the Capitol in an attempt to disrupt the certification of the electoral vote. The defendant's actions throughout this period reflect a deliberate and calculated effort to undermine the democratic process, driven by a refusal to accept the legitimate outcome of the election. His knowledge of the falsity of his claims, coupled with his intent to deceive state officials and the public, forms the basis of the charges against him. The evidence presented at trial will illustrate the extent of this conspiracy, revealing a pattern of behavior that sought to subvert the electoral process and maintain power through deceit and manipulation. In conclusion, the defendant's post-election conduct was marked by a clear awareness of the truth, an understanding that his claims of fraud were baseless, and a willingness to engage in deceptive practices to achieve his political goals. The ramifications of these actions extend beyond the immediate context of the election, raising fundamental questions about the integrity of democratic institutions and the rule of law in the face of disinformation and political manipulation. On December 10, the defendant continued to amplify false claims about the election in Georgia. During a rally in Georgia, he reiterated the baseless allegations of widespread fraud, specifically targeting the integrity of the election workers and the processes in place. He claimed that the election had been stolen and that the results were rigged, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. This rhetoric incited his supporters, leading to increased harassment of election officials and workers. As the days progressed, the defendant's team, including CC1 and CC2, sought to exert pressure on state officials to take actions that would undermine the election results. On December 14, the defendant called P26 again, pressing him to take a more active role in supporting the fraudulent claims. P26 reiterated that he had seen no evidence of fraud and that the election had been conducted fairly. The defendant, undeterred, continued to push for action, suggesting that P26 should publicly support the claims of fraud to rally the public and other officials. In the lead-up to January 6, the defendant's efforts intensified. On January 2, he made a call to Georgia Secretary of State P29, where he infamously urged him to find enough votes to overturn the election results. The call was marked by the defendant's insistence that the election had been rigged and that P29 had the power to change the outcome. P29, maintaining his integrity, informed the defendant that he could not do what he was asking and that the claims of fraud had been thoroughly investigated and debunked. Despite the lack of evidence and the repeated confirmations from state officials that the election results were legitimate, the defendant continued to rally his supporters with false narratives. On January 5, the day before the Capitol riot, he held a rally in Washington, D.C., where he repeated the false claims about the election being stolen and encouraged his supporters to march to the Capitol to fight like hell for their country. The events that unfolded on January 6 were a culmination of the defendant's relentless push for false claims of election fraud. As his supporters stormed the Capitol, they were fueled by the misinformation and rhetoric that had been propagated over the preceding weeks. The defendant's actions and words directly contributed to the atmosphere of anger and violence that erupted that day. In the aftermath, various officials and lawmakers condemned the defendant's actions, stating that his refusal to accept the election results and his promotion of false claims had incited the insurrection. The fallout from January 6 led to widespread calls for accountability and a reckoning regarding the spread of misinformation in American politics. As investigations continued, it became clear that the defendant's attempts to overturn the election results were not only baseless, but also dangerous. The repercussions of these actions would be felt long after the events of January 6, as the nation grappled with the implications of a leader who had sought to undermine democracy itself. The case against the defendant would serve as a critical examination of the intersection of power, misinformation, and the fragility of democratic institutions. The defendant, undeterred by P37's explanation, continued to assert that there were significant irregularities in Wayne County. He claimed that thousands of ballots had been cast illegally and that the election results were manipulated. P38 attempted to interject, stating, "Mr. President, we have conducted our own reviews, and while we are looking into the allegations, we have not found evidence that would change the outcome of the election." The defendant dismissed their concerns, insisting that the election had been stolen from him. He reiterated his belief that he had won Michigan and demanded that the legislators take action to address what he described as rampant fraud. P37 and P38 exchanged glances, recognizing the futility of trying to convince the defendant otherwise. They had come prepared to discuss other pressing issues, but the conversation kept circling back to the election. As the meeting progressed, the defendant's frustration grew. He began to raise his voice, accusing the legislators of not doing enough to support him. "You need to understand that your political futures are at stake here," he said. "If you don't stand up and fight for me, you will be held accountable by your constituents." P37 and P38 remained composed, reiterating their commitment to the truth and the integrity of the electoral process. They emphasized that their duty was to the people of Michigan and they could not support unfounded claims. The meeting concluded without any resolution, and the legislators left the Oval Office with a sense of unease. In the days following the meeting, the defendant continued to amplify his false claims about the election in Michigan. He tweeted, "The election was rigged, and the people of Michigan know it. We will not let this stand." His rhetoric only intensified, and he began to pressure state officials to take action, despite the lack of evidence supporting his allegations. As the deadline for certifying the election results approached, the defendant's campaign staff became increasingly concerned about the potential fallout from his statements. They communicated internally about the risks associated with perpetuating false claims, but the defendant remained steadfast in his narrative. He believed that if he repeated the claims often enough, they would gain traction among his supporters. Meanwhile, state officials, including P37 and P38, faced mounting pressure from constituents and the media. They were inundated with calls and messages from individuals who believed the defendant's claims. P37, in particular, felt the weight of the situation as he tried to balance his responsibilities as a legislator with the demands of his party and the expectations of the public. On December 14, 2020, the Michigan Board of State Canvassers met to certify the election results. The defendant's campaign attempted to intervene, urging the board to delay the certification process. However, the board ultimately voted to certify Biden's victory in Michigan, reaffirming the integrity of the election. In the aftermath of the certification, the defendant's rhetoric did not wane. He continued to publicly attack state officials and spread misinformation about the election. His tweets and statements fueled a narrative of victimhood among his supporters who rallied around him, convinced that the election had been stolen. As the new year approached, the defendant's focus shifted to the upcoming congressional certification of the Electoral College results. He began to rally his supporters, calling for a massive demonstration in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation and anger, as the defendant framed the event as a last stand against what he described as a corrupt system. In the days leading up to the rally, the defendant's campaign continued to push the false narrative of widespread election fraud. They organized communications with various groups and individuals, encouraging them to attend the rally and voice their discontent. The rhetoric escalated, with the defendant and his allies suggesting that the outcome of the election could still be overturned. On January 6, the defendant addressed a crowd of thousands gathered near the Capitol. He reiterated his false claims about the election, inciting the crowd to take action. "We will never give up. We will never concede," he shouted, as the crowd erupted in cheers. The atmosphere was electric, but it quickly turned chaotic, as some attendees began to march toward the Capitol building, leading to an unprecedented breach of the legislative chambers. The events of that day would have lasting repercussions, not only for the defendant but for the entire nation. The fallout from the rally and the subsequent attack on the Capitol would lead to widespread condemnation, legal consequences, and a reckoning over the state of democracy in America. The defendant's refusal to accept the election results and his relentless pursuit of false claims would be scrutinized for years to come, as the nation grappled with the implications of his actions. On December 7, the defendant participated in a rally in Georgia, where he continued to propagate false claims about the election. He told the crowd that the election was rigged and stolen, despite the lack of evidence supporting these assertions. His rhetoric was not only misleading but also incited his supporters, many of whom believed that their votes had been disenfranchised. This atmosphere of distrust was further fueled by the defendant's repeated claims that he had won the election, which he insisted was being undermined by widespread fraud. Meanwhile, CC1 was actively working behind the scenes to pressure state officials in Pennsylvania to take action. On December 8, CC1 reached out to P46 again, urging him to convene a special session of the Pennsylvania legislature to address the alleged fraud. CC1's message was clear. He wanted the legislature to take steps to overturn the election results. P46, however, reiterated that there was no evidence to support the claims of fraud, and that any attempt to change the outcome would be both unconstitutional and politically damaging. Despite the mounting evidence against the claims of fraud, the defendant's campaign continued to push the narrative. On December 9, the defendant tweeted, "The Pennsylvania election was a total disaster. We will not let this happen." This tweet was part of a broader strategy to galvanize his base and maintain pressure on state officials to act. The campaign's messaging was relentless, with CC1 and other surrogates echoing the defendant's claims in various media appearances. As the Electoral College meeting approached, the pressure on state legislators intensified. On December 14, the defendant tweeted again, this time directly targeting the Pennsylvania legislators who had publicly stated their unwillingness to overturn the election results. He called them cowards and traitors, further escalating the rhetoric and creating a hostile environment for those who dared to oppose him. In the days leading up to the Electoral College vote, CC1 continued to coordinate efforts to challenge the results. He reached out to various Republican lawmakers across the country, urging them to support efforts to contest the election results in their respective states. Despite the lack of evidence, CC1 maintained that there was a path forward to overturn the election, insisting that the fight was far from over. On January 6, as Congress convened to certify the electoral votes, the defendant held a rally in Washington, D.C. During his speech, he repeated many of the false claims that had been debunked by courts and state officials. He urged his supporters to fight like hell and suggested that they march to the Capitol to make their voices heard. This incitement led to the violent events that unfolded later that day, as a mob of his supporters stormed the Capitol in an attempt to disrupt the certification process. In the aftermath of the insurrection, the fallout was swift. Many of the individuals involved in the attack were motivated by the false claims of election fraud that had been perpetuated by the defendant and his allies. The consequences of this misinformation were profound, leading to widespread condemnation and calls for accountability. As investigations into the events of January 6 continued, it became clear that the efforts to overturn the election were not only baseless, but also dangerous. The actions taken by the defendant and those around him had far-reaching implications for the integrity of the electoral process and the stability of American democracy. The narrative of widespread fraud, despite being thoroughly debunked, had taken root in the minds of many, illustrating the power of misinformation in shaping public perception and political action. The implications of these events extend beyond the immediate aftermath. They raise critical questions about the future of electoral integrity, the responsibility of political leaders to uphold democratic norms, and the potential consequences of unchecked rhetoric in a polarized political landscape. As the nation grapples with these challenges, the lessons learned from this period will undoubtedly shape the discourse around elections and governance for years to come. Was contingent upon the recount producing a favorable outcome, which it did not. Following the recount, CC5 pivoted to a new strategy. On December 14th, after the legitimate electors cast their votes for Biden, CC5 sent an email to the defendant's campaign team proposing that the defendant's electors meet and cast votes for him anyway, despite the fact that they had lost the election. This email outlined a plan for the electors to sign a certificate, claiming they were the rightful electors for the state, even though they had not been elected. In the days that followed, similar plans were developed in other states where the defendant had lost. The defendant and his co-conspirators coordinated with individuals who had been designated as electors for the defendant in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. They instructed these individuals to meet on December 14th, the same day the legitimate electors were casting their votes, and to sign documents falsely asserting that they were the duly elected electors for the defendant. On December 14th, the defendant's electors in these states convened and signed certificates claiming to cast electoral votes for the defendant, despite the fact that they had no legal standing to do so. These fraudulent certificates were then sent to Congress and the National Archives, creating the false appearance that there were competing slates of electors from these states. The defendant and his co-conspirators intended to use these fraudulent certificates to support their claims that the election results were contested, and to pressure Vice President Pence to reject the legitimate electoral votes during the certification process on January 6. The fraudulent elector scheme was not only a blatant attempt to undermine the democratic process, but also a direct challenge to the rule of law. The defendant and his co-conspirators knew that their actions were unlawful, as evidenced by their efforts to conceal the scheme and their reliance on false narratives to justify their actions. They sought to create confusion and doubt about the legitimacy of the election results, hoping to manipulate the outcome in their favor. As January 6 approached, the defendant continued to amplify false claims about the election being stolen, rallying his supporters to protest the certification of the electoral votes. The rhetoric escalated, and the defendant's calls for action culminated in the violent events that unfolded at the Capitol that day. The fraudulent elector scheme, combined with the defendant's incendiary rhetoric, contributed to an atmosphere of chaos and unrest, ultimately leading to an unprecedented attack on the democratic process. In summary, the defendant's actions in the wake of the 2020 election reflect a concerted effort to overturn the legitimate results through a series of false claims, intimidation tactics, and ultimately, the submission of fraudulent electoral certificates. This plan was not only a violation of the law, but also a profound betrayal of the democratic principles that underpin the electoral process in the United States. The consequences of these actions continue to reverberate throughout the nation, raising critical questions about accountability, the integrity of elections, and the resilience of democracy itself. The fraudulent elector scheme culminated on December 14, 2020, when the defendant's electors convened in several states, including Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. In each of these states, the electors gathered in various locations, often under the guise of legitimate electoral proceedings. They signed certificates of vote that falsely claimed they were the duly elected electors for the defendant, despite the fact that the actual election results had declared the opposing candidate the winner. In Arizona, the electors met at the state Republican Party headquarters, where they signed the fraudulent documents. Similar gatherings took place in other states, with participants often expressing uncertainty about the legality of their actions. Many were led to believe that their votes would only be counted if the ongoing litigation resulted in a favorable outcome for the defendant. This deception was a critical component of the scheme, as it allowed the conspirators to recruit individuals who might otherwise have refused to participate in what they understood to be an illegal act. As the electors signed the fraudulent certificates, the defendant and his co-conspirators were actively promoting the narrative of widespread voter fraud. The defendant continued to amplify his claims on social media, asserting that the election had been stolen and that the legitimate votes could not be certified. This rhetoric served to further justify the actions of the fraudulent electors, as they believed they were acting in defense of what the defendant portrayed as a rigged election. After the electors completed their tasks, the fraudulent certificates were sent to Congress, where they were intended to create confusion and provide a basis for objections during the certification process on January 6, 2021. The plan hinged on the idea that these competing slates of electors would force Congress to debate their legitimacy. thereby delaying the certification of the election results and potentially allowing time for the defendant's legal challenges to gain traction. However, the scheme faced significant hurdles. Many lawmakers and officials recognized the illegitimacy of the fraudulent electors and the certificates they submitted. As Congress convened on January 6, the presence of these false documents was met with skepticism and outright rejection by many members. The vice president, who was tasked with overseeing the certification process, faced immense pressure from the defendant and his supporters to act in accordance with the fraudulent claims. Yet he ultimately chose to uphold his constitutional duty, which further infuriated the defendant and his allies. The events of January 6 unfolded dramatically, as a mob of the defendant's supporters stormed the Capitol in an attempt to disrupt the certification process. This unprecedented attack was fueled by the false narrative of a stolen election, which had been perpetuated by the defendant and his co-conspirators in the weeks leading up to that day. The chaos that ensued not only threatened the safety of lawmakers and staff, but also posed a grave risk to the democratic process itself. In the aftermath of the attack, investigations into the fraudulent elector scheme began to take shape. Law enforcement and congressional committees sought to understand the extent of the conspiracy and the roles played by various individuals involved. The fraudulent elector plan, once a calculated strategy to overturn the election results, became a focal point of scrutiny as the nation grappled with the implications of the events that had transpired. As the dust settled, it became clear that the actions of the defendant and his co-conspirators had far-reaching consequences. The integrity of the electoral process was called into question, and the trust of the American public in their democratic institutions was severely undermined. The fraudulent elector scheme, rooted in deception and a blatant disregard for the rule of law, served as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities within the electoral system and the lengths to which individuals would go to cling to power. In the months that followed, legal repercussions began to unfold. Investigations led to indictments and charges against several individuals involved in the scheme. The fallout from the fraudulent elector plan continued to reverberate throughout the political landscape, as discussions about election integrity, accountability, and the preservation of democracy took center stage. Ultimately, the fraudulent elector scheme not only represented a failed attempt to overturn the election results, but also highlighted the critical importance of safeguarding the democratic process against those who would seek to undermine it for their own gain. The events of January 6 and the actions leading up to it serve as a cautionary tale, reminding us all of the fragility of democracy and the need for vigilance in protecting the rights of every voter. Accept or reject the electoral votes. Pence reiterated that he did not believe he had the authority to change the outcome of the election. The defendant, undeterred, pressed on, insisting that Pence could act in a way that would benefit their cause. As January 6 approached, the pressure on Pence intensified. The defendant continued to publicly and privately assert that Pence had the power to reject the electoral votes, despite Pence's repeated clarifications that he did not possess such authority. The defendant's rhetoric escalated, framing the situation as a battle for the future of the country, and he urged his supporters to rally in Washington, D.C. on the day of the certification. On January 5, the day before the certification, the defendant held a rally where he reiterated his false claims of election fraud and called on his supporters to march to the Capitol. He stated, "If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." This inflammatory rhetoric was designed to incite his base and create a sense of urgency around their cause. Meanwhile, the conspirators continued their efforts to manipulate the situation. CC1 and CC2 were in constant communication, strategizing on how to influence Pence and ensure that he would act in accordance with their plans. They discussed the need to maintain pressure on Pence and to keep the narrative alive that there were legitimate reasons to contest the electoral votes. On January 6, as the certification process began, the defendant addressed a large crowd of his supporters, reiterating his false claims and urging them to march to the Capitol. He stated, "We will never give up. We will never concede." This rallying cry was met with cheers and enthusiasm from the crowd, who were already primed for confrontation. As the crowd marched towards the Capitol, tensions escalated. The defendant's supporters breached security barriers, overwhelmed law enforcement, and stormed the Capitol building. Inside, lawmakers were in the process of certifying the electoral votes when the chaos erupted. The certification was abruptly halted, as members of Congress were evacuated for their safety. In the midst of the chaos, the defendant continued to pressure Pence through social media and direct communication. He tweeted, "Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution." This tweet further inflamed the situation, as it signaled to the rioters that Pence was not aligning with their expectations. As the rioters occupied the Capitol, the conspirators' plans unraveled. The fraudulent elector scheme, which had been meticulously orchestrated, was overshadowed by the violent events of the day. The defendants' attempts to manipulate the certification process were thwarted, and the consequences of the actions taken by him and his co-conspirators began to unfold. In the aftermath, the nation grappled with the implications of January 6th. The actions of the defendant and his co-conspirators were scrutinized, leading to widespread condemnation and calls for accountability. Investigations were launched to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy and the roles played by various individuals in the lead-up to the insurrection. The events of that day served as a stark reminder of the fragility of democracy and the lengths to which some would go to undermine it. The fallout from January 6th continues to resonate as the nation seeks to heal and address the divisions that were laid bare during this tumultuous period. The defendant's actions and those of his co-conspirators will be remembered as a pivotal moment in American history, one that challenged the very foundations of the democratic process. Ensure the continuation of the process, and if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country. This tweet was a clear attempt to manipulate Pence into acting against his better judgment, reinforcing the notion that the vice president held the key to the outcome of the election. As dawn broke on January 6th, the atmosphere in Washington, D.C. was charged with tension. The defendants' rally at the Ellipse was set to begin at 11 a.m., and he had already incited his supporters through a series of incendiary tweets and public statements. The defendants' rhetoric had escalated, framing the day as a last stand against what he claimed was a stolen election. He urged his followers to march to the Capitol, promising to join them, and declaring, "We will never give up, we will never concede." By the time the rally commenced, thousands of supporters had gathered, many of whom were already agitated and primed for confrontation. The defendant took the stage and delivered a fiery speech, reiterating his baseless claims of election fraud and urging the crowd to fight like hell. He told them, "You'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong." The crowd responded with chants of, "Fight for Trump," and "Stop the steal," as the defendant continued to stoke their anger. As the rally concluded, the defendant directed his supporters to march to the Capitol, stating, "I'll be there with you." However, he did not follow them. Instead, he returned to the White House, where he watched the events unfold on television. The crowd, fueled by the defendant's words, descended on the Capitol, breaching security barriers and overwhelming law enforcement. Inside the Capitol, chaos erupted. Rioters vandalized offices, assaulted police officers, and disrupted the certification of the electoral votes. As the situation escalated, Pence and his staff were evacuated to a secure location. The vice president had been steadfast in his refusal to act unlawfully, but now he found himself in a perilous situation, with rioters calling for his name, demanding that he overturn the election results. Back at the White House, the defendant remained passive, seemingly pleased with the chaos that had ensued. He tweeted at 2:24 p.m., "Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution." This tweet further incited the rioters, who interpreted it as a signal that their actions were justified. As the rioters breached the Senate chamber, the defendant's supporters were emboldened by the belief that they were acting on his behalf. The defendant's failure to act decisively to quell the violence and his continued focus on Pence's perceived betrayal only exacerbated the situation. The Capitol was in lockdown, and lawmakers were forced to shelter in place as the insurrection unfolded. In the aftermath of the riot, the defendant continued to downplay the violence, expressing sympathy for the rioters and framing them as patriots. He stated, "These are great people. They're just angry. They're not doing anything wrong." This response further demonstrated his willingness to exploit the chaos for his own political gain, rather than condemning the violence and calling for calm. As the dust settled and law enforcement regained control of the Capitol, the implications of the defendant's actions became clear. His relentless pressure on Pence, combined with his incendiary rhetoric, had culminated in a violent attempt to overturn the election results. The events of January 6th would have lasting repercussions, not only for the individuals involved but for the very fabric of American democracy. The fallout from that day would lead to numerous investigations, legal consequences for those who participated in the riot, and a reckoning within the political landscape. The defendant's role in inciting the insurrection would be scrutinized, as many began to question the extent of his responsibility for the chaos that unfolded. As we reflect on these events, it is crucial to understand the broader implications of the defendant's actions and the threats they pose to democratic institutions. The events of January 6th serve as a stark reminder of the fragility of democracy and the importance of accountability and leadership. The lessons learned from this dark chapter in American history will resonate for years to come, as we strive to uphold the principles of justice, integrity, and the rule of law. As the chaos unfolded at the Capitol, the defendant remained in the dining room, seemingly detached from the gravity of the situation. His focus was on his phone, where he continued to monitor the unfolding events through social media and news coverage. The rioters, emboldened by his words and the misinformation that had been spread, were now inside the Capitol, disrupting the certification process and threatening the safety of lawmakers. At approximately 2:30 p.m., as the situation escalated, the defendant's aides and advisors began to express concern over the violence and the breach of the Capitol. They urged him to take action to quell the unrest and to call for peace. However, the defendant's response was tepid at best. He seemed more concerned with the narrative being spun around the events than with the safety of those inside the Capitol or the integrity of the democratic process. Around 2:38 p.m., the defendant finally issued a video statement, which was broadcasted on various platforms. In this message, he acknowledged the rioters, but continued to perpetuate the false narrative of a stolen election. He told the crowd, "We love you, you are very special," while simultaneously urging them to go home. This statement was met with confusion and anger from many, as it seemed to validate the actions of the rioters rather than condemn them. As the rioters continued to wreak havoc inside the Capitol, lawmakers were evacuated to secure locations, the certification process was halted, and the very foundation of American democracy was under siege. The defendant's inaction and ambiguous messaging only served to further inflame the situation, as many of his supporters interpreted his words as a rallying cry to continue their efforts. By 3 p.m., the Capitol Police and other law enforcement agencies were struggling to regain control of the building. The rioters had breached the Senate chamber, vandalizing offices and threatening the safety of elected officials. The atmosphere was charged with tension, and the cries of the rioters echoed through the halls of Congress. In the aftermath of the violence, the defendant's team scrambled to formulate a response. They recognized the severity of the situation and the potential consequences of the defendant's earlier rhetoric. However, any attempts to distance the defendant from the actions of the rioters were met with skepticism, as the connection between his words and their actions was undeniable. As the hours passed, the Capitol remained in turmoil, and the nation watched in disbelief. The events of January 6th would go down in history as a dark chapter in American democracy, one that was fueled by misinformation, incitement, and a refusal to accept the results of a legitimate election. The defendant's actions and inactions on that day would be scrutinized and debated for years to come, as the nation grappled with the implications of what had transpired. In the days following the insurrection, calls for accountability grew louder. Lawmakers from both parties condemned the violence and sought to hold those responsible accountable for their actions. The defendant faced mounting pressure to address the situation and to take responsibility for the role he played in inciting the riot. As investigations began, the focus turned to the defendant's communications leading up to and during the events of January 6th. The evidence would reveal a pattern of behavior that suggested a deliberate effort to undermine the electoral process and to incite his supporters to take drastic action. The fallout from that day would reverberate throughout the political landscape, leading to discussions about the future of democracy in America and the importance of upholding the rule of law. The ramifications of January 6th would extend far beyond that day, shaping the political discourse and influencing the actions of lawmakers and citizens alike. The nation was left to reckon with the reality that democracy is fragile and requires constant vigilance to protect it from those who would seek to undermine it for their own gain. The events of January 6th were not just a spontaneous eruption of anger. They were the culmination of a deliberate strategy to undermine the democratic process. The defendant's actions and words throughout that day and in the days leading up to it reveal a clear intent to disrupt the certification of the election results. His incendiary rhetoric, coupled with the mobilization of his supporters, created a volatile environment that ultimately led to violence and chaos at the Capitol. As the rioters breached the Capitol, the defendant remained silent for hours, refusing to call for an end to the violence. Instead, he continued to propagate falsehoods about the election being stolen, further inflaming his supporters. This inaction and refusal to condemn the violence not only endangered the lives of lawmakers and law enforcement officers, but also signaled to his followers that their actions were justified. The aftermath of the attack saw the defendant continuing to express admiration for those who participated in the riot. By referring to them as patriots, he sought to legitimize their actions and create a narrative that framed them as victims of an unjust system. This rhetoric served to embolden his base and perpetuate the false claims of election fraud that had fueled the insurrection in the first place. In the days following the attack, the defendant's attempts to exploit the situation became increasingly evident. The calls made by CC1 to senators were not merely an effort to delay the certification, They were a calculated move to manipulate the political process in the wake of the violence. The insistence on objecting to the certification of multiple states was a direct challenge to the democratic principles that underpin the electoral process. Despite the overwhelming evidence that the election was conducted fairly and that the results were legitimate, the defendant and his associates continued to spread disinformation. The false claims of widespread voter fraud were not only baseless but also dangerous, as they undermined public trust in the electoral system and incited further unrest among his supporters. As the early hours of January 7 unfolded, the defendant's efforts to overturn the election were met with resistance from those who upheld their constitutional duties. Vice President Pence, despite the threats to his safety and the pressure from the defendant and his allies, ultimately fulfilled his role in the certification process. His announcement of the election results was a reaffirmation of the democratic process, standing in stark contrast to the chaos and violence that had transpired just hours earlier. The events of January 6 serve as a stark reminder of the fragility of democracy and the lengths to which individuals may go to subvert it. The defendant's actions, both on that day and in the lead-up to it, reflect a profound disregard for the rule of law and the principles of democratic governance. As we reflect on these events, it is crucial to hold accountable those who sought to undermine our democracy and to ensure that such actions are never repeated. The resilience of our institutions and the commitment of those who defend them are vital to preserving the integrity of our electoral process and the foundations of our democracy.